Before we dive into one of the most extraordinary medical revolutions in military history, I want to ask you something. If you're fascinated by how science and courage transformed the battlefield, by how ordinary people achieved extraordinary things under fire, then this is your channel. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you stories that change the world, stories that deserve to be remembered. Now let's begin. Picture a British surgical tent somewhere in the western desert, late summer of 1942. The canvas walls shudder with each gust of hot wind, carrying sand that finds its way into everything. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of ether, carbolic acid, and something else, something harder to name but impossible to forget. The sweet, sickly odor of infection taking hold in torn flesh. A hurricane lamp swings gently overhead, casting shifting shadows across the operating table where a young Royal Army Medical Corps surgeon, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands red to the wrists, works with methodical urgency on a soldier's shattered thigh. The wound is 18 hours old. Shrapnel from a German 88 tore through muscle and splintered bone during an engagement near El Alamein. The field dressing applied by the battalion medical officer did its job, stopped the visible bleeding, but underneath, in the deep tissue planes, contamination has been working silently. Dirt, bits of uniform, bacteria driven deep by the blast, all of it sitting in dead tissue. An incubator for disaster. The surgeon knows what he's facing. He's seen it dozens of times already in this campaign. Even with aggressive debridement, cutting away all the devitalized tissue he can identify. Even with copious irrigation and leaving the wound open to drain. Even with sulfonamide powder dusted into the raw surfaces, the odds are not in the soldier's favor. Gas gangrene, the nightmare that begins with crepitus under the skin and ends, if you're lucky, with an amputation. If you're not lucky, with septic shock and death within days. And there's another enemy, just as deadly but slower. The soldier arrived in shock, his blood pressure barely detectable, his skin cold and mottled. They've given him plasma, the dried powder reconstituted with sterile water, and it's helped, temporarily. His veins have filled a bit. His pressure has come up enough to tolerate anesthesia. But plasma is not blood. It replaces volume, but it doesn't carry oxygen. It doesn't deliver what the tissues are screaming for. And as the night wears on and more casualties arrive, some needing surgery immediately, the surgeon and his team move from table to table, doing what they can with what they have, knowing that their best might not be enough. This was the reality of field surgery in the early years of the Second World War. The British Army Medical Services, inheritors of lessons from the Great War, had made progress. Triage systems, forward surgical teams, rapid evacuation, all of these reduced preventable deaths. But when it came to the two great killers of battlefield trauma, infection and hemorrhagic shock, medicine was still fighting with both hands tied. Sulfonamides, the first generation of antibacterial drugs, help with some infections, but they were weak against the bacteria that thrived in contaminated war wounds. Streptococcus, yes, sulfa could handle that reasonably well, but Clostridium perfringens, the culprit behind gas gangrene, and Staphylococcus, and the polymicrobial soup that festered in abdominal wounds, these often laughed off sulfatherapy. Field surgeons fell back on what had worked, more or less, for generations. Cut out all the dead tissue, leave the wound open, pray that the body's defenses would hold the line. As for shock, plasma had been a genuine advance. The British had organized plasma supply early in the war, drying and distributing it efficiently. It was stable, didn't require refrigeration or blood typing, and you could give it to anyone. For men in shock from burns or dehydration, it was life-saving. But for men bleeding out from torn arteries and shredded organs, plasma was a stopgap, not a solution. What they needed was whole blood, red cells to carry oxygen, platelets to help clotting, all the living components that plasma lacked. But blood was perishable, fragile, required careful typing and cross-matching, had to be kept cold but not frozen, and had a shelf life measured in weeks, not months. Getting fresh blood to a forward surgical unit in the middle of a desert campaign or a mountain advance seemed, to many, a logistical fantasy. Until it wasn't. The transformation began not in the desert, but in laboratories, far from the fighting. In Oxford, Howard Florey and his team had taken Alexander Fleming's old observation about a mold that killed bacteria and turned it into something usable. By 1941, they had produced enough penicillin to treat a handful of patients, and the results were astonishing. Infections that would have meant amputation or death simply melted away under penicillin therapy. But there was a problem. Making penicillin was agonizingly difficult and slow. The mold grew on the surface of culture flasks, and it took thousands of flasks to produce enough drug for one patient. The British pharmaceutical industry, already stretched thin by war production, couldn't scale up fast enough. Florey flew to the United States, where American pharmaceutical companies, with their deep fermentation tanks and industrial resources, began mass production. By 1943, penicillin was arriving in Britain in quantities that made military use possible. The question was how to use it. Penicillin had been tested in civilian hospitals, mostly on infections that were already established, and it worked brilliantly. But battlefield wounds were different. They were contaminated from the moment of injury, and infection began as a race between the body's immune system and bacterial multiplication. Could penicillin, given early, prevent infection from ever taking hold? Could it be used prophylactically, not just therapeutically? The Army Medical Directorate decided to find out, and they sent the first shipments of penicillin to North Africa in late 1943, just as the Allied campaign was pushing into Sicily and preparing for the Italian mainland. The drug arrived in vials as a pale yellow powder, sterile and unbelievably precious. Each vial contained perhaps 100,000 units, and the recommended dose for a dirty wound was 50,000 units, repeated every 3 to 4 hours for the first critical 48 hours. It had to be dissolved in sterile saline just before use, and it could be injected intramuscularly, or it could be instilled directly into a wound, or both. Surgeons learned quickly. Give it early, give it generously, and combine it with the best surgical debridement you can perform. In a casualty clearing station near Salerno, October 1943, a different scene is unfolding. The tents are larger here, the setup more permanent than a forward surgical unit. There are proper operating theaters, recovery wards, even a small laboratory for blood typing. A young officer, a lieutenant in the Royal Artillery, is brought in on a stretcher. He took a shell fragment through the abdomen, and he's in bad shape. His pulse is thready and fast, 140 beats per minute. His blood pressure is 70/40. His abdomen is rigid, distended, and when the receiving medical officer presses gently, the soldier gasps in pain. Internal bleeding, almost certainly, and contamination of the peritoneal cavity from a perforated bowel. This is the kind of injury that kills quickly. The surgeon, a major in the RAMC with 2 years of desert and Mediterranean combat surgery behind him, makes his decisions in seconds. This man needs surgery now, and he needs blood, real blood, not just plasma. He turns to the transfusion officer, a captain who runs the CCS blood supply. They've got whole blood here, stored in glass bottles in a kerosene refrigerator that runs day and night. The blood is less than 10 days old, collected in Britain, mixed with a preservative solution called ACD, acid citrate dextrose, that keeps the red cells viable for up to 3 weeks if refrigeration holds. Each bottle holds a pint, and each pint is labeled with the donor's blood type. The soldier on the stretcher is type O, according to the tag put on him by the regimental medical officer who first treated him. Type O can receive type O, and they've got 6 bottles in stock. The transfusion officer pulls 2 bottles, hands them to a nurse, who takes them to a small stove where a pot of water simmers, gently at body temperature. Giving cold blood to a shock patient can drop their core temperature further, worsen the shock spiral. So the bottles sit in the warm water bath for 10 minutes while the anesthesia team gets the soldier asleep and the surgeon scrubs. By the time the first incision is made, the first bottle is hanging from a stand, flowing through rubber tubing into the soldier's arm vein. The blood is dark and rich, and as it enters his circulation, subtle changes begin. His blood pressure ticks upward, 80/50, then 90/55. His pulse slows slightly. His skin, which had been gray and waxy, begins to pink up, just a little. The surgeon works inside the abdomen, finding the bleeding points, tying off vessels, finding the hole in the small bowel where the fragment tore through. He resects the damaged section, brings the healthy ends together, closes the bowel. Then, knowing that the abdominal cavity is contaminated with bowel contents, he irrigates copiously with warm saline. And then, before he closes, he does something new. He takes a syringe filled with penicillin solution, 200,000 units in 50 milliliters, and he slowly instills it into the peritoneal cavity, bathing the raw surfaces and sutured bowel in a thin film of the antibiotic. Then he places drains and closes the skin loosely. The soldier will also get intramuscular penicillin every 4 hours for the next 3 days, a total dose that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. The surgery takes 2 hours. By the end, the soldier has received 4 pints of whole blood, and his blood pressure is stable at 110/70. He's not out of danger yet, not by a long way. Peritonitis can still kill him. Sepsis can still kill him. But his odds have just improved dramatically. The logistics of getting whole blood to the front lines was a triumph of organization and cold chain management that doesn't get enough credit in the history books. It started in Britain, where the Army Blood Supply Depot, working with the National Blood Transfusion Service, collected blood from volunteer donors. The process was streamlined to an assembly line precision. Donors came in, were checked for eligibility, had their blood type confirmed, and then gave a pint, drawn into sterile glass bottles, preloaded with ACD solution. The citrate prevented clotting. The acid and dextrose nourished the red cells and kept them from breaking down too quickly. Once collected, the bottles were stored in refrigerators at 4 degrees Celsius and transported to airfields. From there, RAF transport planes flew them to North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and later Normandy. The whole system depended on speed and refrigeration. If the cold chain broke, if a shipment sat on a hot tarmac for too long, the blood spoiled, the red cells lysed, and you were left with a bottle of toxic soup. Transfusion officers in the field became experts in improvisation. They scrounged kerosene refrigerators, jury-rigged cooling systems from vehicle radiators, buried bottles in sand during the day, and dug them up at night when temperatures dropped. They learned to recognize bad blood by sight, checking for hemolysis, that telltale pink tinge in the plasma that meant red cell destruction. They learned to keep meticulous records because a transfusion reaction from incompatible blood could kill a patient faster than the original injury. And they leaned heavily on Grupo donors, the universal donor type that could be given to anyone in an emergency without waiting for a full cross-match. In a mass casualty situation, when wounded were pouring in faster than you could type and cross, blood saved hours and saved lives. The combination of penicillin and whole blood didn't just improve survival. It changed the entire philosophy of battlefield surgery. Before, the goal had been damage control. Stop the bleeding, clean the wound as best you could, get the patient to the rear, and hope. After, the goal became definitive early care. Surgeons could be more aggressive because they had the tools to manage the complications. A compound fracture of the femur, the kind of injury that in the Great War almost guaranteed amputation to prevent gangrene, could now be debrided thoroughly, dusted and injected with penicillin, splinted, and left to heal. The fracture would still need definitive fixation later, in a base hospital, but the immediate threat of infection was blunted. Abdominal wounds, the graveyard of battlefield surgeons, became survivable. Resecting damaged bowel, repairing the holes, washing out the contamination, and dosing with penicillin brought mortality rates down from catastrophic to merely high. Chest wounds with lung penetration, hemothorax, empyema. All of these were manageable if you could control the infection and keep the patient's blood volume up. And perhaps most dramatically, gas gangrene, that swift and terrible infection that had haunted every war surgeon since the trenches of Flanders, began to lose its grip. Gas gangrene is caused by Clostridium species, anaerobic bacteria that thrive in dead tissue, producing toxins and gas that spread through muscle planes with horrifying speed. The classical treatment was radical, wide excision of all affected tissue, often meaning amputation, and even then the mortality was high. But penicillin turned out to be exquisitely effective against Clostridia. A soldier with a dirty, ragged wound to the calf, the kind of wound that would have been a near-certain gas gangrene case, could now receive immediate penicillin, both topical into the wound and intramuscular, along with thorough debridement, and the infection simply didn't develop. The impact was measurable and dramatic. Reports from casualty clearing stations in Italy in 1944 recorded gas gangrene rates of less than 1% in casualties who received early penicillin and proper surgery, compared to rates of 5 to 10% in earlier campaigns. 1% versus 5 to 10% doesn't sound like much in the abstract, but when you're talking about thousands of wounded men, that's hundreds of limbs saved, hundreds of lives saved. The real test came with Normandy. The invasion in June 1944 brought all the lessons learned in North Africa and Italy to the largest amphibious operation in history, and the medical planning was meticulous. Field surgical units and casualty clearing stations were prepositioned to land in the first waves behind the assault troops. Blood supplies were stockpiled in England and flown in continuously once the beachhead was secured. Penicillin was issued in unprecedented quantities, not just to surgical units, but to regimental medical officers and even battalion aid stations. The doctrine was clear: get the antibiotic into the wounded as fast as possible, even before evacuation. A medical officer with the East Yorkshire Regiment, landing on Sword Beach on D-Day morning, carried a pack with morphine syrettes, field dressings, and a dozen vials of penicillin with syringes. When a sergeant took shrapnel through the shoulder and upper chest, the MO injected 100,000 units of penicillin into the man's buttock muscle right there on the beach, before the stretcher bearers even arrived. That injection, given within an hour of wounding, may well have made the difference between a routine recovery and a life-threatening chest infection. And it wasn't just the British. The Americans, fully convinced by the British data, were doing the same. Penicillin was becoming a standard of care, as routine as morphine and bandages. The blood supply system in Normandy was a logistics marvel. Within 2 weeks of the landing, a full Army blood supply depot was operating nearby you, with refrigerated storage for thousands of pints and a fleet of refrigerated trucks to deliver blood forward to the surgical units. The trucks, painted with red crosses and marked blood supply, became a common sight on the Norman roads, racing against time and summer heat to get fresh blood to the surgeons who needed it. And the demand was enormous. In the first month of the Normandy campaign, British surgical units transfused more blood than in any comparable period of the Italian campaign. The casualties were heavy, the fighting brutal, and the surgeons worked around the clock. But the survival rates were better. Shock deaths, the men who bled out before they could be stabilized, dropped significantly because whole blood was available forward, not just in the rear. Sepsis deaths, the men who survived surgery only to die days later from overwhelming infection, dropped because penicillin was hitting the bacteria before they could establish a foothold. Consider a typical case from a casualty clearing station in Caen, July 1944. A corporal from a tank regiment is brought in with burns to his face and hands and a penetrating wound to his left thigh from an armor-piercing round that tore through his tank and through him. The wound is deep and bone is visible. He's been given morphine and a field dressing, and he's had an injection of penicillin from the regimental MO 4 hours ago. On arrival, his blood pressure is low, but not critically so, 95/60, and his pulse is 110. He's conscious, frightened, in pain. The triage officer, a seasoned captain, assesses him quickly. Urgent surgery, probable vascular injury given the mechanism, high risk of bone infection. He's typed as a positive, and there are bottles of a positive blood in the refrigerator. The surgical team takes him straight to theater. The surgeon explores the wound and finds what he feared. The femoral artery is partially transected, leaking but not completely severed, and the femur has a comminuted fracture. He repairs the artery, a painstaking job with fine sutures, and then he turns to the fracture. He debrides all the loose bone fragments and devitalized muscle, irrigates the wound extensively, and then packs it with gauze soaked in penicillin solution. The wound is left open. During the surgery, the corporal receives 2 pints of whole blood, and his vital signs stabilize. Post-operatively, he gets penicillin every 3 hours, 50,000 units each time, intramuscularly. The nurses, working 12-hour shifts, mark each dose on his chart with meticulous care. On the 3rd day, the surgeon reopens the wound under anesthesia, inspects it, sees that the tissues are healthy, pink, no signs of infection, and closes the skin. This delayed primary closure, closing the wound after the infection risk is passed, becomes standard practice when penicillin is available. The corporal develops no infection. His fracture will need more surgery later, but he'll keep his leg, and he'll walk again. A year earlier, that same wound would likely have ended in amputation or death from sepsis or gas gangrene. The difference is penicillin and blood. The numbers tell the story, though wartime statistics have to be interpreted carefully. The British Army medical historians, analyzing casualty data after the war, noted that mortality from severe extremity wounds dropped from around 15% in the early campaigns to around 8% by the end of the war. Mortality from abdominal wounds, historically catastrophic at 50% or higher, came down to the low 30s, still grim but a real improvement. Gas gangrene, which had accounted for thousands of amputations and deaths in the Great War, became a rarity. And perhaps most telling, the time wounded soldiers spent in hospital before returning to duty, or being invalided out, shortened significantly. Faster recovery, less chronic infection, fewer complications. All of this meant more soldiers returned to their units, and more lived to go home after the war. These weren't miracles. They were the result of good science, good logistics, and the extraordinary dedication of the medical officers, nurses, orderlies, and transfusion teams who made the system work under impossible conditions. A surgical sister, a Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service veteran who served from North Africa through to Germany, later recalled the moment she knew they'd turned a corner. It was in a CCS in Belgium, autumn 1944. They'd had a mass casualty event, a company caught in an artillery barrage, and the wounded arrived in waves. The surgeons operated for 16 hours straight, and the blood ran through their hands faster than she'd ever seen. Every man who reached them alive got blood and penicillin, no exceptions. And at the end of that terrible night, when the last surgery was finished and the wards were full of bandaged, sleeping men, the commanding medical officer walked through the rows and said quietly, more to himself than to anyone, "We didn't lose one to shock." Not one. That had never happened before in her experience. Not in a mass casualty situation like that. Some would die later from their injuries, but none bled out on the table. None slipped away from shock in the hours after surgery. The blood had held them, and the penicillin would keep them safe from infection while their bodies healed. The penicillin story had its complexities. It wasn't a magic bullet, and surgeons learned its limitations. It didn't replace good surgery, it enhanced it. A wound packed with dead tissue and foreign material would still become infected, penicillin or not. The drug could only reach bacteria if there was blood flow to the tissue, which is why debridement, cutting away all the non-viable tissue, remained essential. And there were bacteria that penicillin couldn't touch. The gram-negative organisms, Pseudomonas and Proteus, and E. coli, often found in abdominal and urinary infections, were resistant. But even with those limitations, penicillin's impact was transformative, and the British Army's willingness to experiment, to gather data, to adjust protocols based on real-world results, set the standard. Field trials conducted in Italy and Normandy tested different dosing regimens, different routes of administration, different timing strategies. They found that topical penicillin in powder form, dusted into wounds, was less effective than dissolving it in saline and instilling it, because the powder didn't distribute evenly. They found that intramuscular injection worked well for systemic coverage, but for deep or contaminated wounds, direct installation into the wound bed gave better local concentrations. They found that starting penicillin within the first 6 hours after wounding was far more effective than waiting until signs of infection appeared. These lessons were written up, circulated, incorporated into training, and by the war's end, every RAMC officer knew the basics of penicillin prophylaxis. The blood transfusion service evolved in parallel. The early reliance on Group O universal donor blood gave way to a more sophisticated system as the logistics improved. In established casualty clearing stations and base hospitals, there was time for full typing and cross-matching, which meant you could use the most compatible blood for each patient and stretch the supply further. But in forward surgical units and mass casualty situations, Group O remained the workhorse. The British also pioneered the use of walking blood banks, where soldiers from nearby units would volunteer to donate on the spot when supplies ran low. A transfusion officer would set up a collection point, screen donors for blood type and basic health, and draw blood directly into bottles with ACD, which could then be used within hours. It was improvisational, risky by modern standards, but in a desperate situation, it worked. And it reinforced the sense among the troops that the medical services would move heaven and earth to save them, that no resource was too precious if it meant keeping a man alive. The psychological impact of that, the knowledge that if you were hit, you had a fighting chance, shouldn't be underestimated. It was part of what kept morale up even in the grinding attritional battles of Normandy and the winter advance through the Low Countries. By the time the war ended in Europe, in May 1945, the British Army had transfused hundreds of thousands of pints of blood and administered millions of units of penicillin. The medical records, preserved in archives, paint a picture of a medical service that adapted and learned with incredible speed. From the desert heat of North Africa to the mud of Normandy to the frozen Ardennes, the principles remain constant. Early surgery, aggressive debridement, penicillin prophylaxis, blood transfusion to maintain circulating volume and oxygen delivery. And the results spoke for themselves. The British soldier in 1945 had a far better chance of surviving a severe wound than his father had in 1918, and the difference was measurable in the survival statistics. The legacy of this work rippled forward into the post-war years and beyond. The transfusion techniques developed by the military became the foundation for civilian blood banking. The refrigerated storage, the use of anticoagulant preservatives, the typing and cross-matching protocols, the concept of regional blood supply depots, all of this transitioned seamlessly into the National Health Service when it was founded in 1948. And penicillin, once a rare experimental drug, became a mass-produced commodity, the first of the antibiotics that would transform medicine in the second half of the 20th century. The surgical principles learned on the battlefield, the importance of early intervention, the marriage of surgery and antibiotics, the use of blood products to support critically ill patients, these became standard teaching in medical schools and surgical training programs. Modern trauma surgery, the kind practiced in emergency departments and trauma centers today, owes an enormous debt to the lessons learned by RAMC surgeons in tents and Nissen huts under fire. There's a direct line from those casualty clearing stations to the protocols used today for civilian mass shootings, motor vehicle accidents, and natural disasters. The concept of damage control surgery, operating quickly to control bleeding and contamination and leaving definitive repair for later when the patient is stable, was refined in World War II. The use of blood products in massive transfusion protocols, giving balanced ratios of red cells, plasma, and platelets to patients in hemorrhagic shock, echoes the lessons learned about whole blood versus plasma. The emphasis on antibiotic prophylaxis in penetrating trauma, giving antibiotics early and broadly to prevent infection, comes straight from the penicillin trials in Italy and France. Even the logistical systems, the idea of having blood and critical medications pre-positioned and ready to move quickly, the cold chain management, the tracking and record-keeping, all of this has its roots in the military medical services of the Second World War. And it's not just technique and logistics. There's also a philosophical legacy, the idea that aggressive, well-resourced medical care at the point of injury is worth the investment, that you don't wait for the patient to reach a sophisticated hospital. You bring the sophisticated care forward to the patient. That idea, radical in 1942, obvious now, was proven in the mud and blood of World War II. So when you see a modern air ambulance landing at an accident scene, when you hear about trauma surgeons performing emergency surgery in the field, when you read about blood banks maintaining stockpiles for disasters, remember where those systems came from. They came from the men and women of the Royal Army Medical Corps and their allied counterparts, working in conditions that would be unimaginable to most civilian practitioners, making do with limited resources and unlimited determination, proving that medicine and organization and courage could push back against the chaos of war. They saved tens of thousands of lives, and they taught the rest of us how to do the same. If this story moved you, if you want to hear more about the people and the science that changed history, then do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join this community. We're building something here, a place where these stories, these incredible human achievements, get the attention they deserve. Don't just watch and walk away. Be part of it. Subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.